On a warm spring day in Rome, April 21, 2025, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled with a deep and mournful rhythm. The world had lost Pope Francis, the humble shepherd from Buenos Aires who became one of the most beloved and transformative popes in modern history. But his story, his journey of faith, courage, simplicity, and compassion, began far from the Vatican. This is the story of Pope Francis. Long before the white robes, the papal balcony, and the global reverence. He was simply Jorge. A quiet boy born into the dust and devotion of Buenos Aires. December 17, 1936, in the working-class neighborhood of Flores, Argentina, a boy came into the world under the watchful eye of heaven and the quiet prayers of a mother who knew suffering well. His name, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. His father, Mario José Bergoglio, was a railway worker from Portocamaro, Italy. He fled Mussolini's fascist regime with a single suitcase and a Bible. He came to Argentina not as a dreamer, but as a survivor. His mother, Regina Maria Savori, was a devout Catholic from Buenos Aires with Italian roots. Gentle but strict, Regina carried within her both fire and faith. She ruled her home with love and lit candles before the Virgin each night. Jorge was the eldest of 5. He didn't grow up in privilege. He grew up in modesty, where dinner wasn't guaranteed, but grace always was. He loved soccer, tango, and the books of Jorge Luis Borges. He had a passion for literature, chemistry, and poetry. But underneath it all was something else, something deeper. He watched how his father folded his hands in silence after a hard day's work. How his mother whispered prayers over sick neighbors. And he wondered if this quiet power had something to do with God. But this was no perfect childhood. A family secret haunted the early years. Jorge's mother had once been told she might never walk again after a tragic accident. She recovered, miraculously, but never stopped warning her children, life can disappear in a second. Never waste it. This formed young Jorge's soul. He watched as his grandmother, Rosa, would pray the rosary daily with tears, remembering her home in Italy that she would never see again. Rosa became Jorge's first spiritual guide. She taught him prayers in the old dialects, told him stories of saints and martyrs, and whispered to him, "Never forget the poor. That's where Jesus hides." These weren't bedtime tales. They were blueprints for the man he would become. At the age of 21, Jorge suffered a near-fatal illness. He came down with severe pneumonia, and part of his right lung had to be surgically removed. Doctors thought he might die. It was the first time Jorge confronted his own mortality. But in that hospital bed, between pain and fear, he began to feel what he later called the intimacy of Christ. This brush with death became a hidden chapter of transformation. It made him quiet, serious, and different. He returned from the hospital. Not with fear, but with a question. What does God want from me? One day, at 17, Jorge walked into a confessional. The priest was ordinary. The room was plain. But what happened inside was eternal. He described it simply. It was in that moment. I knew. God was waiting for me. That moment, ordinary to all but him, was the beginning. It was not thunder. It was not glory. It was mercy. And mercy would become the very marrow of his soul. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was 17 years old when the world cracked open around him. It was the spring of 1953, and he had plans, chemistry, girls, perhaps a job at the lab. He was brilliant, curious, independent. But one afternoon changed everything. He stepped into a parish church for confession, not seeking transformation, only forgiveness. But what he found there was destiny. Something happened to me. I cannot explain it. But I knew. God was waiting for me. That day, he didn't just find absolution. He found his vocation. Jorge began to drift away from his former ambitions. The sciences faded. The voice within grew louder. He approached the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Known for their intellectual rigor, global missions, and radical discipline, they weren't the easiest order to join. But Jorge was drawn to their spirit of service and their motto, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God. In 1958, at age 21, he entered the seminary in Villa Devoto. He gave up romance. Gave up ambition. Gave up self. He was no longer just Jorge. He was now a novice, living in community, praying before dawn, scrubbing floors, studying philosophy. But he carried something others didn't, lungs that had betrayed him. At 21, he lost part of his right lung to a severe infection. Doctors said he might never breathe normally again. It was a time of fear, he later said. But also of surrender. I knew I had to trust God completely. Jorge was sent to Chile to teach literature and psychology. He discovered a gift: he could reach people, through stories, through listening, through laughter. He returned to Argentina and pursued theological studies. He took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But one vow remained: obedience to the Jesuit superior. And that obedience would soon test him. In 1969, he was ordained a priest. And by 1973, at only 36, he was appointed provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina. It was a role of immense power. An enormous burden. Argentina was entering a dark time: political unrest, dictatorship, violence. The church was split. Some priests supported revolution. Others cooperated with the regime. Father Bergoglio walked a tightrope. He discouraged radicalism. Sheltered some. Distanced others. Later, he would be accused of not doing enough to protect persecuted priests. He would live with that pain, and that silence. I made decisions with little experience. I was young. I hurt people. I asked forgiveness, he confessed decades later. But in those years, he earned a reputation: fierce discipline, deep spirituality, and a profound love for the poor. He lived simply. He cooked for seminarians. He prayed for hours. And above all, he listened. The man who once found God in a confession now heard him in every confession he received. The path to the papacy began not with ambition, but with a whisper in the dark. God called me. I simply followed. The 1970s in Argentina were a time of terror. The military dictatorship, La Dictadura, had seized control. They promised order. They delivered fear. Thousands disappeared. Priests were kidnapped. Students tortured. Mothers wept in the Plaza de Mayo, holding photos of sons who never came home. And at the heart of it all stood Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Jesuit provincial, just 36 years old. He was not a soldier. But his battlefield was the soul of the church. Some priests embraced revolution, preaching liberation theology and armed resistance. Others feared communist uprisings more than the regime itself. Jorge tried to hold the middle line: protect his priests, avoid bloodshed, preserve the Jesuits. But neutrality in times of tyranny is dangerous. Two Jesuit priests, Father Orlando Yorio and Father Francisco Jalix, remained in the slums after being told to leave. They were kidnapped by the regime. For years, Jorge was haunted by what followed. Some accused him of abandoning them. Others said he secretly negotiated their release. He never gave a full public account. But years later, Father Jalix forgave him. We reconciled. The matter is closed, he said. Still, shadows lingered. And so did guilt. In 1980, Jorge was removed as provincial. He was sent into internal exile, teaching theology, cleaning floors, reflecting. For a man of influence, it was humiliating. He was no longer in charge. He was silent. Out of the spotlight. almost forgotten. But in that silence, something profound was happening. "The Lord stripped me of everything," he later said. "And I learned that He was enough." He read the lives of saints. He deepened his devotion to the Virgin Mary. He found new strength in silence, in simplicity, in sorrow. He lived alone in Córdoba for 2 years, without friends, without power, without voice. And yet, it was there, among dusty books and whispered prayers, that he was remade. "God prepared me in exile for what I could not yet see," he once reflected. His exile taught him something about power. That it can corrupt even the faithful. That leadership without humility is a dead end. And that the church must always serve, never dominate. Jorge's reputation as a strict Jesuit softened. He emerged from his exile with a new heart. One more merciful. One more broken. One more ready to serve. From this crucible of dictatorship and disgrace rose a future pope. Not hardened, but humbled. After leading Argentina's Jesuits through storms of fear, betrayal, and bloodshed, Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio was cast aside. No ceremony. No scandal. Just silence. In 1986, he was quietly removed from influence. Sent to a small Jesuit residence in Córdoba, far from Buenos Aires. No lectures. No responsibilities. No pulpit. Only books. A Bible. A bed. And time. "They took away my voice," he said years later. "So I learned to listen." He spent 2 years in spiritual exile. He read, wrote, prayed, reflected. He heard confessions, even from strangers who wandered in without knowing who he was. He cooked for himself. Cleaned for himself. Slept little. Spoke less. The man who once led the powerful Jesuit province now scrubbed bathrooms in silence. But something sacred was happening beneath the surface. This wasn't punishment. It was purification. Jorge realized he had once clung to authority too tightly. Acted with rigidity. Failed to listen deeply enough. And so he let go. Of pride. Of pain. Of ego. "I was broken," he admitted. But God uses broken tools. He began to see Christ more clearly, not in books, but in wounds. Not in titles, but in touch. He saw Christ in prisoners, in the homeless, in tired mothers holding crying babies. He wrote letters, many unsent. He studied the mystics. The saints. The abandoned. He wept. And he healed. In this exile, he formed a secret spiritual devotion. He entrusted himself to the Virgin Mary, untier of knots, a little-known German painting of Mary patiently untying a ribbon tangled in knots. "She unties the knots of our lives," he said. "If we let her." The devotion would later spread across the world. Because of him. In 1992, after nearly a decade away from public view, the Church called him back. This time, not as a Jesuit leader, but as Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires. The man who had been exiled now returned with gentleness in his step and fire in his heart. He didn't seek power anymore. He sought people. Especially those the world left behind. And so, the bishop's mitre rested on the head of a once broken man. Who had finally found strength in his weakness. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio became auxiliary bishop in 1992, he had one request. "Please, no fancy residence. I want to live with the people." He chose a small, humble apartment instead of the bishop's palace. He cooked his own meals. Took public buses. Wore a simple cross. Buenos Aires noticed. So did Rome. In 1997, he was appointed co-adjutor archbishop, next in line for the top post in Argentina's capital. And when Cardinal Antonio Quaricino died in 1998, The quiet bishop who swept church floors in Córdoba. Became Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But Bergoglio didn't change. He still walked the streets alone. He still visited the villas, Argentina's shantytowns, where sewage ran in the open and children played near trash heaps. He hugged drug addicts. Kissed babies. Shared make tea with janitors. You must smell like the sheep, he told his priests. Not like perfume. He opened church doors to single mothers. To atheists. To people living in sin and shame. Some bishops disapproved. He didn't care. In 2001, Pope John Paul II elevated him to Cardinal. He traveled to Rome in borrowed robes, refusing to buy new ones. In the sea of red silk and golden rings, he stood out. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't help it. In Rome, he remained invisible by choice. He avoided media. Declined interviews. He had one focus, the poor. He redirected church funds to slum parishes. He condemned corruption, both in government and within the church. And when Argentina faced economic collapse, he criticized greedy bankers and heartless politicians. We cannot worship both God and money, he thundered from the pulpit. In the 2005 conclave, following John Paul II's death, Bergoglio was whispered as a possible pope. According to reports, he came second. But he begged his fellow cardinals not to vote for him. I am not the one, he said. And so Benedict XVI was elected. And Bergoglio returned quietly to Argentina. More than ever, he tried to disappear. But God was not done with him. And destiny was circling back. As scandals erupted in the church, abuse, greed, cover-ups, the Vatican's soul was crumbling. In 2013, Benedict XVI did the unthinkable. He resigned. The papal throne was empty. And eyes turned again. To a man from the southern hemisphere. Not a celebrity. Not a politician. Not a royal. But a priest who rode the subway. A cardinal who ate with the homeless. A shepherd who smelled like his sheep. The Sistine Chapel, March 13, 2013. Black smoke had risen twice. But on the third day, white smoke billowed above the Vatican. The bells of St. Peter's thundered. And from the balcony came a name. No one expected. Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam. Francis come. Not Jorge. Not Bergoglio. Just Francis. The name alone was a shock. No pope had ever taken it. He chose it in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the man who embraced poverty, loved animals, and rebuilt the church brick by brick. The message was immediate. This pope would be different. He stepped onto the balcony with no crown. No red cape. Just white. Simple. And smiling. He looked over the crowd in silence. Then said, Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera. Brothers and sisters, good evening. The square roared. But he raised his hand, not to bless, but to ask for their blessing. The world stood still. A pope. Asking the people to pray for him. It had never happened before. From that moment, Pope Francis began a revolution. Not of politics. But of presence. He refused the papal palace. Lived in a guest house. Ate in the cafeteria with gardeners and janitors. He washed the feet of Muslim immigrants. He hugged disfigured men. He wept with victims of abuse. He told gay Catholics, "Who am I to judge?" And to the world's richest powers, he said, "The economy must serve people, not enslave them." Some cheered. Some condemned. But no one could ignore him. He published an encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si, calling the earth our common home. He challenged the powerful. This planet is being destroyed by greed. The poor suffer most. He preached mercy over judgment. Reform over ritual. Heart over hierarchy. And yet, he was not naive. He knew the wolves. He faced backlash inside the Vatican, accused of heresy, betrayal, weakness. But he never flinched. "I'd rather have a bruised church that goes out to the streets," he said, "than a church sick from clinging to comfort." He was the first pope to address the U.S. Congress, and the first to visit the slums of Manila, the prisons of Bolivia, and the refugee camps of Lesbos. Everywhere he went, he asked for one thing: "Pray for me." He broke traditions. But he didn't break the church. He reminded it of its roots. A man in white. Arms outstretched. Walking among the wounded. Laughing with children. Consoling the dying. A pope, not of palaces. But of people. For all his humility and hope, Pope Francis walked into a storm. Not outside the church. Inside it. Behind the walls of the Vatican were secrets. Some ancient. Some rotting. Sexual abuse. Cover-ups. Financial corruption. Political infighting. Francis didn't turn away. He opened the books. He summoned bishops. He fired cardinals. He wept with survivors of abuse, and begged forgiveness on behalf of the church. But the deeper he dug, the louder his enemies became. Some said he went too far. Others said not far enough. He disciplined bishops accused of negligence. Called out clergy who protected predators. But in some cases, Chile, France, the US, his responses were slow or misjudged. Critics called him naive. Victims demanded more. And through it all, Francis stayed in the fire. "I am a sinner," he once said, "but I trust in the mercy of God." He launched financial reform at the Vatican Bank, long plagued by mafia rumors, missing millions, and dirty money. He shut down secret accounts. Appointed outside auditors. Pushed for transparency. But resistance ran deep. Vatican insiders leaked documents. Anonymous letters accused him of betraying tradition. Some conservative cardinals demanded he resign. One even accused him of heresy. He didn't respond with rage. He responded with prayer. And silence. "The devil wants division," he said. "But Christ calls us to unity." His teachings on mercy, divorce, and homosexuality were seen as radical by some. He never changed doctrine. But he changed tone. He welcomed debate. He urged bishops to walk with wounded hearts, not throw doctrine like stones. And in all this, he carried pain. Not just from critics. But from friends. Some priests he trusted turned on him. Some reforms were stalled by men he once defended. Yet he kept going. His health declined. He suffered from sciatica, knee pain, colon surgery. He began using a wheelchair. But never stopped working. Never stopped smiling. Never stopped loving. "The church is not a museum," he told the faithful. "It's a field hospital, after battle." Even as the church tore itself apart in debate, scandal, and fear, Francis stood in the center. Not as a warrior, but as a wounded healer. In his final years, Pope Francis moved slower. The cane became a wheelchair. The trips abroad were fewer. But his heart, as fierce as ever. He continued writing. Preaching. Pleading for peace in a world consumed by war. Ukraine. Gaza. Sudan. Myanmar. He didn't care about sides, he cared about souls. "War is always a defeat," he said, "for everyone." He welcomed refugees into the Vatican. He kissed the feet of rival leaders from South Sudan, begging them to stop fighting. He met with atheists, scientists, imams, rabbis, street cleaners. He called for nuclear disarmament, for economic justice, for the protection of Mother Earth. The poor and the planet cry out, he warned. And we must answer with courage. He called for a church that walks with the broken, not judges from balconies. And even as traditionalists fought his every move, he never once closed the door on them. The church is a mother, he said. She embraces all her children. Behind closed doors, he spoke of death, of being ready, of knowing the clock was ticking. I will not be Pope forever, he once smiled. One day, I will go. And someone else will walk this path. He gave final interviews, shared final reflections. And then, quietly, as he had lived, he faded. No drama. No panic. Just silence. A white-clad shepherd, returning home. April 2025. The Vatican confirmed the news. Pope Francis had died. The first pope from Latin America. The first Jesuit pope. The first to take the name Francis. Crowds filled St. Peter's Square. They came not for a royal funeral, but to honor a man who walked with the poor, who kissed the wounded, who made the mighty uncomfortable, and the broken feel seen. His final words, it is said, were whispered. Señor, perdona. Y guía tu iglesia. Lord, forgive and guide your church. No golden crown rested on his casket. Just a simple wooden box. A white stole. And the prayers of billions. His legacy. Not perfect, but powerful. Not one of power, but of mercy. Not a monument of stone, but a heart that bled for the world. He was Jorge. He was Francis. He was a servant. And now, he rests. Pray for me, he once asked. And now the world does.
Hey, thanks for watching this amazing story and welcome to Video Biographer, where every life has a story and every story deserves to be told. If you believe that every person has a journey worth knowing, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a life story that could inspire or inform you. Ready to explore more? Choose one of the videos on your screen and discover a life that you should know about. This is Video Biographer, where stories live and life speak. See you in my next video. If there's a life story you'd like me to cover, drop your suggestion in the comments. Until then, stay blessed and take care.